chapter 6, section 2. We are going to talk in this section about the Hebrews. They're going to have a great influence on the world. Their religion still exists today, and that would be the religion of Judaism. Followers of Judaism are called Jews. So the Hebrews are going to begin as nomadic herders. They wandered around with their flocks. Some were traveling merchants, and they would lead these long donkey trains, and they would walk from trading post to trading post. And they're going to begin in Ur, which we talked about when we talked about Mesopotamia. There they made goods from copper and gold and ivory, and they traveled towards Haran up top there near the Turkish mountains, where they traded for silver. Some even went down along the Mediterranean coast, where they traded with the Phoenicians and with the Egyptians. The history of the Hebrews is recorded in the Bible, and their God was Yahweh. We are not exactly sure of the exact spelling or pronunciation of this because the Hebrews actually didn't write with vowels. And the Hebrews later on don't say the actual name of God. They thought it was disrespectful. They weren't worthy of saying the name of God. So we've had to, over time, guess at the vowels, and our best guess is Yahweh. Now, Yahweh is going to be different than many of the ancient gods. Most other gods behave like humans, but Yahweh was different. Yahweh didn't get hungry or thirsty or marry somebody, and only did the right thing, even though was all powerful. Yahweh is going to make an agreement with Abraham. And he's going to tell Abraham and his followers to leave Ur and to go to Canaan and to worship Yahweh as the only God. And if they were to do this, Abraham and his descendants could stay in Canaan forever. So around 1800 BC, Abraham is going to settle in Canaan. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, is going to have 12 sons. These 12 sons of Jacob was Abraham's grandson, are going to form the 12 tribes of Hebrews. And the Hebrews are going to stay in Canaan for 100 years. And then there ends up being a drought. And so they're going to end up going to Egypt looking for food. When they get to Egypt, the Hebrews are going to be enslaved. 600 years later, so they've been enslaved now for 600 years. 600 years later, the new leader of the Hebrews is going to be Moses. And he told the Pharaoh to end this enslavement. And at first the Pharaoh says no, but with some convincing, the Pharaoh is going to eventually agree to end their enslavement, and he lets the people, the Hebrews, he lets them go. But as they are leaving, the Pharaoh changes his mind. And he's going to send his army after the Hebrews. And this is where the Bible states that Yahweh parted the Red Sea so the Hebrews could cross the Red Sea and escape to the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula. This escape is called the Exodus. And in the Bible, there's a book called Exodus, which details this. But now they're in the desert. And life is going to be hard in the desert. And Moses tries to tell the people not to give up. And Moses will eventually be led up to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, he's going to receive a message from God. And Yahweh says that he will protect the Hebrews. And he will lead them back to Canaan. And he's going to establish a covenant between the Hebrews and God. A covenant is an agreement. And he comes down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. And they're to obey the 10 Commandments as part of this covenant. And when it comes to the 10 Commandments, they have things like, you should be loyal only to Yahweh and don't worship any other gods or idols. This is where you see the ideas of it's wrong to lie or steal or murder. Honor your parents. Respect other people's property. The Hebrews believed God was just, so they should be just as well. And so they would use law to influence their behavior. And the laws would affect the whole communities. It's this idea of social justice. Everyone has the right to be treated fairly. Now, Moses is going to die before they actually get a chance to enter Canaan. Without Moses, the Hebrews were afraid to enter Canaan without a strong leader. The people in Canaan, we've already talked about them, they lived in walled cities and they had soldiers guarding the cities. The new leader of the Hebrews was Joshua. And he was a good general. And by this time, the Hebrews had become farmers and they had become shepherds. But there wasn't a lot of rain, and the soil was rocky. Really, the rainy season was only about 2 months. They would collect and store the water. They would use it to irrigate. They copied Canaanite tools. They copied the Canaanite alphabet. Most of your Hebrews are going to live in one-room houses, and usually the room was divided into 2, one section higher than the other. Cooking and chores were in the lower level in the daytime. At night the animals would bed in the lower level. The walls were mud bricks. The floor was clay. They would have wood beams that support this flat, thatched roof. So this was kind of your average Hebrew home. Now, eventually, Joshua, as their leader, is going to die. And those tribes, those 12 tribes, kind of go their own separate ways. And each tribe was led, there's the 12 tribes, they kind of go their own way, and each tribe was led by a council of elders. And in crisis, like a time of war, they would have a judge that would lead them, and the judge could settle disputes, because in a crisis, in a time of war, you don't have time to get a council together and discuss stuff. You need to make a decision. But they need a king to unite the Hebrews again because they're kind of separated in these 12 tribes. And Saul is going to become the first king. He's going to rule for several years, but eventually he kind of starts losing the support of the people. When Saul dies in battle, David becomes the new king. And he's going to reunite the Hebrews. You know, he defeats the Canaanites, captured a Canaanite fortress where he's going to establish the city of Jerusalem, which is going to be the Hebrew capital. It was David that wrote many psalms in the Bible. Psalms are sacred songs. When David dies, the next king is going to be Solomon. Solomon was David's son. He brought peace to the Hebrews through trade and treaties. I mean, he's going to make the Hebrews more powerful. And he has a huge temple built in Jerusalem. Solomon is famous for his wealth and his wisdom. But not everybody always likes Solomon. Some don't like him. They complain about his taxes, or they don't like working on his building projects. Eventually Solomon dies, and the Hebrews in the north are going to set up their own kingdom, and it's going to be called Israel. And the Hebrews in the south set up their own kingdom, and it was called Judah. And the Judah is where Jerusalem was located. And these two kingdoms are going to fight for 200 years. And all they eventually do is weaken each other. And others will end up conquering them. They've made themselves so weak. This brings us to the prophets. If you're familiar with the Bible or church at all, you'll recognize some of these names. But these were people claiming to have messages from God. And they criticized the way that the Hebrews were living. You know, you've got rich mistreating the poor. You got government officials taking bribes. And they reminded the Hebrews of their commitment to God. And they warned of punishment if they don't follow that covenant. Some prophets even said Yahweh was the God of all people, not just the Hebrews. The thing is, the Hebrews didn't listen to the prophets, and they kept doing their own things, and eventually the Hebrews are taken over. By 722 BC, the Israelites in the north disappear. The Judeans in the south are actually moved to Babylon in 586. So they're captured and taken to Babylon. While in Babylon, they have no temple to worship in anymore. The temple had been destroyed in Jerusalem. What they do is they actually meet on the Sabbath, which is the day of rest, and they would pray and they would discuss religion and history, and they would write down laws and sayings and stories. They really began to value learning. They would study scrolls. Teachers became very important leaders to the Hebrews. They're going to spend about 70 years in Babylon. Eventually, they will be allowed to return home, where they will rebuild Jerusalem and they will rebuild the temple. Ezra is going to help write down the laws of Moses. And this becomes 5 books known as the Torah. Later on, other books will be added, and it will become the Old Testament of the Bible. So the Old Testament of the Bible is the history of the Hebrews. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are the Torah. As far as contributions that they've made, the Hebrews were the first people to be monotheistic, believing in one God. They're the first also to believe in a just God. And because God was just, individuals and society also had to be just. And laws would be designed to teach people to be fair to others.